What does it mean to be a patriot?
It's time for USUN Report. Here's Tom Osborne.
These are the stories making headlines this week. The Trump-Putin summit is set to unfold in Cold War venue Helsinki on July 16th. President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin will hold their first summit in this venue famed for its Cold War diplomacy. Nervous U.S. allies in Europe and Russian skeptics will be looking on. U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo visits North Korea next week to discuss the country's denuclearization plans. U.S. Senator Bob Menendez, ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, said the administration had not satisfied his concerns about the sale to members of a Saudi-led coalition of thousands of precision-guided munitions. These could be used to kill Yemeni civilians. The sale is a Trump administration plan to sell high-tech munitions to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The decision could derail the sale. Pope Francis installed 14 Catholic churchmen as cardinals on Thursday, putting another stamp on the group that will one day elect his successor. The Pope ordered the cardinals to serve the poor and to shun palace intrigue. Lack of patriotic youth is different with millennials, and it may not change anytime soon. Which brings us to our topic this week on USUN Report. What does it mean to be a patriot? Here's our resident historian and political scientist, Dr. David Canervo, to give us the backstory. David?
Thank you, Tom. Over 250 years ago, people began to settle the land that became the 13 original British colonies and the United States. They created a society that suited most of them, and those colonists believed they had become a part of a way of life that, while not perfect, nevertheless pleased them. Over time, they developed an affinity for their new homeland that would lead them to pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in its defense. The feelings that arose in the early Americans are not different, probably, from the feelings found in any nation's population. Regardless of where one lives, people want to feel a loyalty to the land of which they are a part. All of us want to be a part of something bigger than our own lives, for which we can feel genuine pride. As we in the United States approach a holiday that celebrates our creation as an independent nation, we can be proud about our nation and its philosophical underpinnings, spelled out in the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. We face justifiable disagreements over the path we took to get where we are, but we need to remember that our journey as a nation is not finished, and that disagreement settled in peaceful ways is the fuel that keeps the light of democracy burning. Ken?
Thank you, David. Just a reminder to our audience, the USUN Report team is made up of a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, and a liberal voter for good measure. Our audience can decide which one of us is which. In this way, we represent the political spectrum in both Washington, D.C. and across the country. Let's begin with this clip from the Reading Through website called Patriots and Loyalists. What's the difference?
In late May of 1775, news of the battles at Lexington and Concord reached London. When George III was told of the defeat at Concord, he called his undersecretary a liar and claimed victory. He knew this meant war. The king was quoted as saying, "I'm not sorry that blows must decide." In the American colonies, public opinions on a war with the mother country were divided. A civil war-like atmosphere ensued in some areas, splitting many families. Those who supported the war against George III in Britain were given the name Patriots. Patriots came from a wide array of social and economic backgrounds. Lawyers such as John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, planters like Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, merchants, farmers, and ordinary citizens all helped to bolster the rebellion. Many patriots were active before the war in the Sons of Liberty or similar groups. The most prominent leaders of the Patriots included wealthy men such as John Hancock, well-educated individuals like Benjamin Franklin, and political activists such as Samuel Adams. Consensus among historians is that around 45% of the white colonists supported the Patriots' cause. Opposing the efforts of the Patriots were the Loyalists, who supported the British monarchy. They were commonly referred to as Tories, and the largest number of Loyalists were found in the colonies of New York and New Jersey. Loyalists also made up a substantial portion of the population in North and South Carolina, where royal governors there attempted to recruit people to their side. In the South Carolina backcountry, where many Scottish immigrants lived, even larger numbers of men fought for the British than they did for the Patriots. Loyalists in these areas tended to be older and wealthier, but many chose to side with the king for reasons other than loyalty or fear of losing fortunes if trade markets were threatened. Many active Church of England or Anglican Church members remained loyalists throughout the war's entirety. By the summer of 1776, Patriots controlled most of the territory in the American colonies, and royal officials were removed from power. Loyalists in the South were persecuted by local patriots. Property was confiscated, and outspoken supporters of the king were even threatened with public humiliation or physical attack. Some loyalists who actively aided the British were even executed. At the end of the war, about 20% of the loyalists fled to areas that remained in the British Empire, especially Canada. The exit of so many royal officials, wealthy merchants, and landowners had a profound impact on many colonies. However, the vast majority of loyalists stayed in the colonies and became citizens of the new republic. Historians have estimated that about 20% of the 2.5 million whites in the American colonies were loyalists, accounting for around 500,000 people.
Tom Osborne, the Canadians that I know still refer to themselves as Tories. 500,000 people, 3 million people. The numbers were so much smaller back then. Is this your definition of a patriot?
Well, it is, and it isn't. You know, I found in my research, Ken, that there's almost a natural division of patriotism which splits off into national pride, and that's fine. In fact, it can be an ideology of love of the country or a devotion to the homeland, a sense of alliance with other citizens who share the same values. And it can be a combination of many different features relating to one's own personal life, ethnic, cultural, political, historical. We're seeing that in our country these days. But the bottom line is that too often it encompasses a set of concepts closely related to nationalism. An excess of patriotism in the defense of the nation is called chauvinism or jingoism. An English term, of course, we know is the patriot, began in the Elizabethan era. The fatherland has many good and bad connotations, as we see throughout history, and certainly 1939, the abstract noun appears in the early 18th century. The general notion of civic virtue exhibited in group dedication is the underpinning of the word. However, since the 18th century, loyalty to the state was in contrast to loyalty of the church, and this is certainly a factor in the United States. Clerics should not be allowed to teach in public schools. Their homeland was heaven. One of the most influential proponents of this classical notion of patriotism was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Enlightenment thinkers also criticized what they saw as the excesses of patriotism as well. 1774, Samuel Johnson published The Patriot, a critique of what he viewed as false patriotism. Patriotism, he says, is the last refuge of the scoundrel. I have to leave it there for now. Turn it back to you, Ken.
Well, there are philosophical issues here. Patriotism may be strengthened by adherence to a national religion, a civil religion, or even a theocracy. And this is the opposite of the separation of church and state. You're listening to USUN Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb. And we'll be back right after these messages. Welcome back to USUN Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb. In this segment, we are honored to feature one of our returning correspondents, playwright Michael Solsona, who's on a patriotic mission. Here's his interview. Michael, welcome back.
Good to be back, Ed.
Now, you've been writing something and working on a very interesting project. Would you share that with us now?
I've been working a lot on vets cases. whether there be benefits or health care issues, you name it, I've done it. And this case was brought to me about this guy named Mendez. He was in the Marine Corps. He died in 1967 on the battlefield. He ran into an ambush. His platoon did, and he was saving his platoon commander's life, who was an officer.
His full name is Angel Mendez, is that correct?
Right.
Angel Mendez certainly qualifies for being a patriotic hero. Could you tell us a little bit about your writing and what you've got so far?
Now I'm pretty much at the research stage, which is clearing up all the hearsay, clearing up all the fanfare. I want to bring it down to bare bones and make it a simple request for a Congressional Medal of Honor.
And Michael Salsoni, you've written a beautiful piece to Angel Mendez. Would you care to share that with USUN Report?
Sure. There isn't much to say about the Vietnam War that hasn't been said already. The next thing I believe we're working on is how to make as if it never happened. In fact, those who protested the protesters have jumped ship and joined those who protested the unjust war. I lost both legs in Vietnam and am the recipient of the Bronze Star carrying a V for valor. I don't know exactly what that means, but what I can tell you is that I had no clue as to what was going on during the 60s and 70s. But serving as a Marine, if anything, was the only thing that I was really proud of. As a basic rifleman, it wasn't any of my business to know what was going on. I was told what to do, and I did it. Coming home was interesting. You aren't considered a hero, but you were a disgrace to the nation. You were a crybaby, a loser, a killer, a coward, a drug addict, and most of all, a troublemaker. Through the grace of God, none of those accusations stopped me from doing what I wanted to do. I had my own parade when I came home, and that lasted for about 10 years. I was told once to stop looking in the rearview mirror because that ain't the direction you want to go in. It became my credo because at the end of the day, as we all know, God don't like ugly. And the road before us we can change, whereas the road behind us is nothing more than a tapestry of colorful intentions. Which brings to mind the name Sergeant Angel Mendez, United States Marine Corps. On March 16, 1967, a young Corporal Mendez found himself in the middle of a battalion-sized ambush. Taking heavy enemy fire, an already wounded Corporal Mendez assisted fellow Marines to safety. He attempted to help his platoon leader, who had already been wounded himself. The platoon leader caught another round to the leg during the attempt, and so did Angel, which brought him to take his last breath on the field of battle. Angel was awarded the Navy Cross and promoted to sergeant posthumously. Decades had gone by, and everyone from elected officials to local military organizations and members of Angel's hometown community worked hard in upgrading Angel's Navy Cross to the Congressional Medal of Honor. Sergeant Mendez has been honored every way imaginable. He had a post office renamed after him, but no Medal of Honor. The pursuit of Angel's Medal of Honor lay dormant for some time, and although I don't know for sure, but I've been told that there are still some who are actively involved in bringing the medal home for Angel. I truly believe that. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, a new game plan is being set in place. A new way to approach the securing of Angel Mendez's Medal of Honor. The United States Marine Corps League Detachment 246 is stepping forward. As a member, I can tell you we are not young, we are not pretty, we are not polite, nor do we have anything to lose. We are only here to make the wrongs before us right. We are comprised of Marines from World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, post 9/11, and from nearly every conflict imaginable on this planet that warranted our attention. We do not discriminate, do not judge, we do not compromise, negotiate, or settle for anything else other than to serve our cause gallantly. As an advocate and service officer representing Detachment 246, I was pretty much minding my own business. My days started usually at 7:30 a.m., and ran into 2 a.m. at times dealing in the field with veterans from all branches of the service who are either in distress or in need of help with obtaining benefits or submitted claims. The Commandant of the Marine Corps League and a past commander, who is now the judge advocate, called me in and assigned me to Angel Mendez's case in behalf of the detachment, which basically means get the medal, bring it home, and call us if you need us. As a Marine, as a basic rifleman in Vietnam, better known as a grunt, I prefer to work like that. The less moving parts, the better. The problem started immediately. There were too many moving parts in obtaining Angel's medal. I didn't want to interfere with anyone's hard work or any plans set in action. But in a few weeks working on the case, I found that the journey many have traveled in obtaining the medal suffered from confusion, and that took over as if it was a cancer. The left hand had no idea what the right hand was doing. The lack of actual documentation needed was either missing or no submission was made to access the documents. Hearsay became fact. The Department of Navy and the Department of Defense became the bad guys when in fact were needed to become our allies in helping with Angel Mendez's case. About 25 years ago, I was assigned to write a stage play and screenplay based on the life of a Medal of Honor recipient, Dwight H. Johnson. The job led me to return to Vietnam alone and find a site where Dwight Johnson's actions earned him the medal. During that time, I made friends with another Medal of Honor recipient, the infamous David Mad Dog Dovey. We became great friends. In saying that, I have been involved in the world of the Medal of Honor recipients and know how sensitive approaching their past may be. The Angel Mendez case is no different. The truth is essential, and respect is all you have when entering their lives. There are some rules I would like to suggest following if we want to bring the medal home. Unity is the key. If the community can work together as one to move forward, that would create an unstoppable force. The second is to keep in mind hearsay is a death wish in presenting or obtaining facts. The third is to keep the request for Sergeant Angel Mendez's Medal of Honor simple and orderly. As an advocate, I've found that keeping my case factually documented, simple, and truthful with intent leaves those behind the other side of the desk with nowhere to go. We respectfully want them to deal with us. It shouldn't be us dealing with them. The United States Marine Corps is not an occupying force. It never has been and never will be. Our stays are short and to the point. We are the few, and so is Angel Mendez. We leave no one behind, as Angel showed us by his action. He was an example of what we're all about. Never to be forgotten, brother. It's what makes us different. Semper Fi. This is Mike Solsona for US-UN Report.
Wow, fascinating story, right, guys?
Very fascinating.
Yes,
always from that guy. He's great.
Tom Osborne, besides the Angel Mendez story, who else comes to mind as a patriot today?
Well, today, actually, one comes from World War II. Audie Murphy was probably one of the most famous heroes. My father talked about him all the time, and I guess I would choose my father as one of the other people. He passed away this past year, but he was someone who flew 37 missions as a turret gunner in World War II, and never heard him talk about it once. I asked him once, well, what, did you just go? Or he says, you did what you had to do, you did what you were told. And that's how some of these men became patriots. Ken?
Dr. Canerva, your thoughts?
Well, I think about a couple of my former students who were ROTC students as well as political science majors who then entered the armed forces. And both of them died. One died in Afghanistan. One died in the so-called Gander crash following a peacekeeping mission in Egypt. And I think about their loyalty to the nation, their enthusiasm for serving the country. And I consider people who are enthusiastic about serving, certainly as patriots, and we have lots and lots of them in this country. But also, apart from the military, I think of all those who want to serve, who want to help others, as certainly patriots. Ken?
Well, I'd like to nominate Michael Solsona for all his work with the veterans. You're listening to USUN Report with Dr. Canervo, Tom Osborne, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb. We're up against a hard break, but we'll be back right after this.
Welcome back to USUN Report. I'm David Canervo, along with Tom Osborne, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb. And we're talking about what it means to be a patriot. Ken?
Thank you, David. Here's an audio clip from an American president known as the Gipper.
I don't know whether you know it or not, but I have a new hobby. I am collecting stories that I can actually prove are told among the Russian people. They make them up themselves, they tell them between themselves, reveals they got a great sense of humor, and they've also got a little cynical attitude about things in their country. And one of these stories, the one I'm going to tell you, I told to General Secretary Gorbachev, and he laughed. The story was an American and a Russian arguing about their two countries, and the American said, look, in my country, I can walk into the Oval Office, I can pound the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running our country. And the Russian said, I can do that. The American said, you can? He says, yes. I can go into the Kremlin, to the General Secretary's office, pound his desk and say, Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way President Reagan's running his country.
David, can you elaborate a little more on Ronald Reagan's popularity? Was he a great patriot?
Well, I think he was certainly a patriot. He seemed to show through his words, through his actions, that he loved the United States and wanted to do everything he could to promote it. One of the things I think that's, of course, very true about Ronald Reagan is his ability to communicate. As a former actor, he has quite a good speaking style. He is able to speak emotionally. And I think that tends to grab people and pull them into what he is saying and touch on their emotions as well, so that they kind of go right along with him through his speech or his stories and identify with him. So I think that was one of the things that exuded from Reagan, which helped people to see him as a patriot. Ken?
Tom Osborne, George Orwell, in his influential essay, Notes on Nationalism, he distinguished patriotism from the related concept of nationalism. By patriotism, I mean devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world. How do young people feel today?
It's a very difficult and confusing scene, Ken. The research that I did, I focused mainly on the millennial population, of course. A particular piece by Gabriel Bosch in the publication called The Stream has a really intense discussion of this. A member of the generation that will take us into the next century and running this country for the next decade is not really that patriotic. An interesting theory is measuring patriotism. They found the correlation between war propensity and patriotism. And Bosch, a millennial herself, writes, as a member of the generation that will take us into the next century, a millennial generation has earned plenty of labels, and patriotic is not one of them. She writes that a lack of patriotic youth is different with millennials and may not change anytime soon. Millennials don't see themselves as patriotic. The most one can give is their life for their country. That's what we believe. That's a burden we all carry, either through our support and taxes as well as our burden to defend our country. But guess what? Millennials are not joining the military either. A recent survey found 85% of the millennials showing no interest in serving in the military. A young man that was born in 1963 was 11 times likelier to have served than a millennial man or woman is today. And according to Pew Research, only about half of the millennials say the phrase, quote, a patriotic person, close quote, describes them very well. 75% of boomers say this describes them very well. Millennials are more likely to consider themselves citizens of the world than citizens of the United States. They do not believe in an American exceptionalism, would be very hesitant to call America. And she says the best country in the world is not America in their opinion, but they are globalist approach to world affairs, more concerned with our actions and how they're perceived and how they affect the world around us. And what about citizenship and duty to country? Well, millennials resist associating with political parties, churches, or affinity groups. They want to be seen as an independent in their thoughts and actions. A few thoughts on one person's point of view of her own generation. Ken?
Well, now here's a couple of famous quotes. The first one from Voltaire. "It is lamentable that to be a good patriot one must become the enemy of the rest of the world." And this from Marxism. Marxists have taken various stances regarding patriotism. On one hand, Karl Marx famously insisted that the working men have no country and that the supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. The same view is promoted by present-day Trotskyists and such as Alan Woods, who's in favor of tearing down all frontiers and creating a socialist world commonwealth. And finally, on the other hand, Stalinists and Maoists are usually in favor of socialist patriotism based on the theory of socialism in one country. Dr. Canerva, would you care to weigh in on these thoughts?
Well, it seems to me that the interest in globalism comes because of the global economy. There's been much more emphasis, I think, over the last 20 years, how the world has become much more interconnected. Economically, so certainly, but also I think socially and politically. We travel to different countries rather easily today. People from the United States want to travel to Europe, to Asia, so that there's this feeling that we really aren't all that different and that we are all part of one world. So I think that has to do with it partially. The socialist notions, I think, are one in which they're looking at a class-based patriotism, so to speak, in which people are to be loyal to their social class. And, of course, for communists, it's the working class. And everybody else is the enemy. So I think that has to do with part of what's going on. And I think also for the millennials, that what we see is, again, a much more of an emphasis on globalism, that we are all part of a larger world. And at the same time, I think people who are in school today are much more likely to be introduced to stories of American faults and criticisms than students were 50 years ago. Ken?
Tom Osborne, patriotism these days is a lot like Christmas. Lots of people caught up in a festive atmosphere replete with lights and spectacles. And we hear reminders about the true meaning of Christmas, and we may even mutter a few guilt-ridden words to that effect ourselves. But each of us spends more time and thought in the parties, the gift-giving, and the other paraphernalia of a secularized holiday than we do deepening our devotion to the true meaning. And so it is with patriotism, especially on Memorial Day in May, Flag Day in June, and Independence Day in July. You walk down any main street in America and ask one citizen after another what patriotism means, and with few exceptions, you'll get a passel of the most self-righteous but superficial and often dead-wrong answers. America's founders, the men and women who gave us reason to be patriotic in the first place, would think we've lost our way if they could see us now. What do you think, Tom?
Well, I think they're on the right track. There's a lot of racial prejudice rising to the surface during this generation's coming out. Anti-bullying campaigns are on the rise. There's debates about privilege and access in our country. And these millennials have a heightened awareness of the haves and the have-nots, which we do not. They've been raised with a heightened sense that being number one isn't the only game in town. In fact, it matters how you win the game to them. I guess the question to us is, how do they vote? Do they vote more or less? Maybe we'll look at that in the next segment. Ken?
Well, since the infamous attacks of 9/11, Americans in near unanimity have been feeling patriotic. For most, that sadly suffices to make one a solid patriot. You're listening to USUN Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb, and we'll be back right after this.
Welcome back to USUN Report. I'm Tom Osborne with Ken McCaleb and Dr. David Canervo. Ken?
Thanks, Tom. This next clip is from a film narrated by Gregory Peck called Years of Lightning, Days of Drums. It features the very short tenure of JFK's presidency.
This was the world John Kennedy had elected to face, and the people of his country had elected him to face it. And so the pickets marched, and Washington, D.C. could see them. And as they marched, the president was drafting the 6 faces of the new frontier inside the gates of the White House. The Peace Corps, the conquest of space, an alliance for progress, civil rights, freedom, and peace were the 6 faces of the new frontier.
There can be no greater service to our country and no source of pride more real than to be a member of the Peace Corps of the United States.
And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it.
That's what the Alliance for Progress means, to provide progress, revolutionary progress, through peaceful democratic means. I think it can be done. I think we set out on an important journey.
In too many parts of the country, wrongs are inflicted on Negro citizens, and there are no remedies at law. Unless the Congress acts, their only remedy is the street. That no free nation can retain any illusions about the nature of the threat, and that no free nation can remain indifferent to the steady erosion of freedom around the globe. We do not believe that war is unavoidable, or that negotiations are inherently undesirable. We do believe that an end to the arms race is in the interests of all.
Tom Osborne, would you qualify JFK as a great patriot in the same standing as Ronald Reagan, Abraham Lincoln, and all the other U.S. presidents?
Certainly would. I think the president had a barely short 2 years, a little over. And in that time, you have to look at what he accomplished. You mentioned a few things here in this particular promotion. The Peace Corps, Latin America, the Alliance for Progress, the showdown of the 62 missile crisis was phenomenal. I mean, if you've read, and I have read the exchange of letters between Khrushchev and Kennedy during that period, you could see that it took 2 men who were looking at the world and wondering how they were going to save it from destroying itself. And they were the only 2 men in the room. And they decided together that this was not the time or the place, or if ever, to do this. So that made him, I think, certainly fit into the pantheons of great presidents, even though it was a short time. I think another thing about the president, President Kennedy, was that he had personality that we've not seen in the White House for some time, at least not in my lifetime. A great sense of humor. Anybody who watched the weekly press conferences, they were televised. Can you imagine the gumption of a young president of 43 years old, and he decides to have weekly press conferences and televise them? Well, as a matter of fact, it was the first time in America, I think, we've enjoyed press conferences since Franklin Roosevelt. So it was a great time to grow up in that period, a very impressionable period in my teens through high school and into college. I thought about that, and I thought of the president throughout my career and lived by some of the very important ideals that he implanted in all of us during those short years that he was president. Ken?
Dr. Canervo, do you think these are fair statements? Patriotism is not love of country, if by country you mean scenery. Patriotism is not blind trust in anything our leaders tell us or do that just replaces some lofty concepts with mindless goose-stepping. Patriotism is not simply showing up to vote. You need to know a lot more about what motivates a voter before you can judge his or her patriotism. David?
Well, I guess I would disagree somewhat with the statements. I think it can be a love of place. It's certainly not just the scenery, but I think it is a love of the nation and what it stands for. And it's a matter of wanting what is best for the nation rather than just following the nation blindly regardless of what it does. And I think that's one of the factors that we often forget, in that when people disagree with what the government is doing at the time, as what happened during the Vietnam War, those protesters certainly in their own minds, I think, saw themselves as patriots as well, and that they had a nation that they loved, but it was going down the wrong path at the moment. Now, while they were a minority, nevertheless, they loved the nation and the ideals for which it stood. So I think that we need to look at patriotism as something of a loyalty, a fondness for the nation, but also a nation which we see as justified our loyalty. I would find it very difficult, for example, for someone to be, if they were at all knowledgeable, a patriotic German during the Nazi years, if in fact they had any inkling at all of what they were doing to the Jews. It seems to me that was so horrible that it would be very difficult to support a nation doing that. And so, again, it's a matter, I think, of appropriate support for wanting to make the nation that they're in a better one. Ken?
I know this concept of patriotism puts an American spin on the term, but I don't know how to be patriotic for Uganda or Paraguay. I hope the Ugandans and Paraguayans have lofty ideas that they celebrate when they feel patriotic, but whether or not they do is a question you'll have to ask them. I can only tell you what patriotism means to me as an American. Tom Osborne, what does it mean to you?
Well, to me it means that I don't have to be afraid of who I am. It means that I can say within reason what I believe, that I can build a family, that I can build a home where I want. I can travel away from the country when I want to. I can come back when I want to. I don't have to worry about someone looking over my shoulder when I go to the market or go to the bank or go to my office. There are so many ways that populations are watched these days, and I think it is, of course, not just the Russian Federation and others, but in some ways we have to be careful ourselves. Ken?
Well, you know, the most highly ranked presidents contained many of the usual suspects. Abraham Lincoln has always rated as the greatest president with an average score of 95 out of 100, followed by George Washington and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the rest in the top 10 were Teddy Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and Bill Clinton made the list, Andrew Jackson and Woodrow Wilson. Now, in your opinion, Dr. Canervo, who are the greatest patriotic presidents?
Well, I would have to go with the perhaps consensus top 3 or 4 coming from Illinois. I have always been a Lincoln supporter. I thought that his strength during the Civil War, his wisdom was beyond compare. Washington, I thought, was terribly important because of the precedents he set as the first president of the United States, traditions that we still follow today. Other presidents, Franklin Roosevelt certainly faced down the Depression and then World War II. So we tend to, I think, rank presidents according to the crises which they face and how they deal with those crises. Presidents who were not terribly successful in dealing with crises tend to be, of course, ranked much lower, such as Richard Nixon, someone who broke the law. I'm a little surprised at Andrew Jackson's ranking as being in the top 10 because of the Indian Removal Act that was passed during his presidency and the Trail of Tears that occurred under him. But again, maybe there are other things that I'm not thinking of that people found outstanding about him. Ken?
Thank you, David. In my humble opinion, the greatest patriotic president would be Thomas Jefferson, the man that wrote the Declaration of Independence and died on the 4th of July, which is what he wanted. He and John Adams died a few hours apart, and Jefferson died first, and his last words being, "Is it the 4th?" Adams died a few hours later, his last words being, "Jefferson lives on." You're listening to USUN Report, and when we come back, we're going to summarize today's show, what it means to be a patriot. So stay with us. Welcome back to USUN Report. This is our show's summary segment where we get a chance to share some final thoughts, and we now turn to our news team editorialist, Miss Mary Saliba. Mary?
Thanks, Ken. What does it mean to be a patriot? It's as old as the country itself, when there was a war to become us. Patriots were for this new country of ours. Loyalists were for the king. We are no longer fighting for our survival at its most basic formation, so the term patriot is less basic and has been thrown into causes and speeches ever since. In divided times, the distinction between nationalism and patriotism gets blurred. Mark Twain said it best, "Patriotism is supporting your country all the time, and your government when it deserves it." This country hasn't always proven itself to live up to its values, that all men are created equal, and built into the Constitution is the right of the people to say so. The courage of patriots taking unpopular stands, Abraham Lincoln, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King, is vital to the country's evolution toward what it aspires to be. The simplest protest of all, kneeling during the anthem at a football game, caused an uproar from the stands to the White House. To love what this country stands for enough to protest when those tasked with upholding its values appear to not be doing so is the most fundamentally patriotic thing someone can do. Another way to exhibit patriotism is to show up and vote, something a shocking number of Americans did not do in our last election, nearly half. In the way that one who knows the least yells the loudest, in the absence of true confidence in ourselves and our country, symbols of that nation become more forced, more shiny, more in your face, bigger bumper stickers, bigger parades. But true patriotism isn't forced, it's a belief and it's in one's heart. The simple show of American patriotism, waving a flag for example, once meant I'm for America and what we stand for, and it has been used to protest, to celebrate, to honor. More recently, the flag itself has been co-opted by white supremacists and those who would perpetuate hate crimes as well as extreme nationalists. Waving it now might be saying, I am against what you are. It is my hope that all Americans can take back the flag as a symbol of what this country stands for and the commitment of its people to honoring those values. Patriots love America, not always what it does, and patriots vote. This has been Mary Saliba for USUN Report. Ken?
Thanks, Mary. Freedom, understanding it, living it, teaching it, and supporting those who are educating others about its principles. That, my fellow Americans, is what patriotism should mean to each of us today. Dr. Canerva, would you like to share some of your final thoughts?
Thank you, Ken. I know that some time back in history, someone reportedly said that my country, right or wrong, but always my country. And while that is certainly one view of patriotism, it doesn't tend to be mine, because when countries make mistakes, as they all do, then it seems to me that we need to not necessarily lose faith in that country and stop being a patriot, but it doesn't mean we have to support what it is that they do that is wrong, but rather try to get the country back on the right path. So for me, patriotism is belief in our Constitution, belief in our Declaration of Independence, and support for the institutions of government, the rule of law that we have in this country, and the freedoms which the Constitution affords to us. If we think about the freedoms we have in this country, they are so much more than what we might expect in a place like Russia or China. Ken?
Patriotism is to defend your particular patch of land against invasion, theft, or bullying from other patches of land, neighboring or not. A typical patriot will take arms to fend off invasion and will never join a foreign army or deliver sensitive information to a foreign secret service. Nationalism, on the other hand, is the idea that your patch of land is so special that it deserves to be put above all others, And when they have any kind of relationship, a typical nationalist will campaign to buy shirts made locally, will promote only folk music. Tom Osborne, as always, you have final say.
Well, thank you, Ken. You know, academics and the writers of history textbooks have too often been complicit in the trend to airbrush our history. We all know that. If we feel ourselves unworthy as a country, it will ultimately be impossible for us to project power as we should. Such are dangers of self-indulgent patriotism. And being worthy is not a matter of simplifying our past, but also about feeling rightly uncomfortable with parts of it. With these thoughts in mind, I'm afraid we'd run out of time. We could pursue this all day. We hope all our listeners will give benevolent patriotism found in the birth of our nation a try as we celebrate the independence of our nation. For Ken McCaleb, our executive producer, Dr. David Canervo, our resident historian and political scientist, Mary Saliba, our editorialist. I'm Tom Osborne, joining with our team in thanking you for listening, and we look forward to joining you next week for another U.S. UN Report.